main focus of the financial world is on Europe, not only the ECB but also the Davos World Economic Forum. And at Davos, my colleague Nazipo spoke to Mark Spelman, who's the MD of Accenture, earlier on. Here's what he had to say.
Well, I think it's not so much a talking shop, but it's really about a sounding board. I think what you find is you get a lot of people who come here who have got ideas, but what they're looking for is to test those ideas, sometimes with public figures, sometimes with other sort of business leaders. So if I look at last year, we had, as a delegation from Accenture, something like 70 meetings with chief executives. And it's not just from one particular region, but it's all over the globe. So you've got different industries, different parts of the world, and that is a unique forum. And so the reason why I keep coming back is because fundamentally it's an opportunity to get a platform and an understanding about what 2015 is all about and to test some of my ideas with other people.
Let's talk about some of those ideas. What kind of ideas are you hoping to have a sounding board for at this particular meeting?
Well, I think there's a very interesting paradox in the world at the moment, which is that the economic world is getting more interconnected, and that's partly through things like trade, but also the digital economy. But at the same time, politics seems to be getting more and more local. And so what I'm really interested in is understanding at the first level, what are the prospects for the global economy, looking at different regions around the world. I think the US and China, for example, will be okay in 2015. So looking at that, but then trying to counterbalance that with understanding how people are looking at some of the geopolitical risks. That creates the context in which you can then explore what is happening at different businesses in different parts of the world.
You talk about an increasingly integrated world. Let's take that focus and put it onto Africa. Yep. Where are the opportunities for Africa to take advantage of this integration? And do you get a sense from a policy level that that kind of approach is being adopted?
Well, I always like to start with demographics, consumerism, and urbanisation, because if you look at what's going on in Africa, clearly one of the great advantages Africa has got, it's got a relatively young population, it's growing rapidly. You also see an increase in urbanisation, and although we do still have a lot of poverty in the African continent, we also see rising middle classes, we see the growth of consumerism, and I think that's becoming an increasingly more attractive market. So as you begin to see segmentation in the African market, I think that creates a lot more opportunities, particularly for consumer goods companies and retailers who are looking to expand.
Are consumer goods companies and retailers rethinking their business approach to Africa? And if they are, what are some of the key trends that you're seeing coming through?
Well, obviously one of the key questions for Africa is looking at supply chains, because there's challenges with infrastructure. Quite often, how do you move goods across borders? So questions about where do you actually want to locate factories? And then very often the big issue is around the last mile. How do you actually get product, particularly into cities in different parts of the, in different sort of sub-regions? So I think the key question is really always about supply chain and how do you optimize the supply chain around your sort of key assets.
And the role of technology in that particular equation. We hear that in Africa there are more mobile phones than in any other region in the world. Are these two centres converging?
Absolutely. I think one of the great opportunities for digital is to leapfrog. And if you look at digital, it isn't just about sort of consumerism. If I think about the applications of the digital revolution, you've got opportunities around healthcare. For example, you can provide information to people about sort of maternity needs. You can use it obviously for mobile payments, which you can provide agricultural inputs in there. You can help people also with voting and where polling stations are. So the key message is that digital genuinely has an opportunity, I think, to help Africa leapfrog actually and to really move forward relative to many of the more mature markets.
How do we make sure that African economies don't get left behind? We've seen the digital revolution take off in East Africa, for example, but there are many economies that seem to have failed to latch on to the revolution. How do we ensure that they get onto the bandwagon?
Well, one of the things that I've seen very sort of positively is the opportunity to try and give people access to internet, because as people get connected, their ability to expand their knowledge through access to information becomes sort of very powerful. So if you can create corridors whereby you've got sort of broadband, you've got access to the internet, you can also create the if you like, the hubs where people can use that, whether that's small, medium-sized enterprises or whether that's agricultural holdings. That creates, if you like, bottom-up if you like, centres where people can sort of grow and develop and prosper. And I think it's as much about the bottom up as it is about the top down. You obviously need the basic infrastructure there, but I think the more that you can catalyse around industrial corridors, hubs, centres of excellence and digital, that's the way that you can see things beginning to develop, expand and move forward.
And finally, of course, access is one part of the equation, and that's what you've spoken to, but cost of connectivity is a big issue in Africa. How do we ensure that the policy is sharp enough to also address that deliverable?
Well, I think there's two types of costs. One is obviously the access to sort of very cheap smartphones, and what you're seeing is smartphone costs coming down all the time. Different types of smartphones, I think, will increasingly being available. I think what the telephone companies are also beginning to realise is that actually you can segment the costs around access to information. So there may be core services which you provide for free, there might be other services that you actually charge a fee for. And so I think what we're going to see is more sophistication in terms of the way that people provide pricing bands and pricing structures for consumers.